let me just give you a few examples where I think we have specific historical confirmations of details in the Gospels that, given the Old Testament backdrop, seem to be a bit too striking to be coincidental. One is Jesus' death at the time of Passover. Now, that is an historical detail that can scarcely be denied, that Jesus died at the time of Passover. And it's a detail that's attested by all four Gospels and implied by Paul in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7. It's not a detail that the Gospel authors or their sources plausibly misremembered. And so many details in the Gospels are connected to Jesus' death being at the time of Passover. It's also supported by the next example I'll consider as well. It's clear that New Testament authors unanimously consider Jesus to be the ultimate fulfillment of the Passover lamb. The correspondence, therefore, seems too neat to be the result of coincidence. Christ's execution by the Romans at the time of Passover is a remarkable coincidence that would have been difficult for an impostor to engineer. One caveat to consider is that there are other days throughout the year, such as the Day of Atonement, to which we might attach some special significance if Jesus' death had landed on those days as well. So I'll therefore assign a conservative Bayes factor of 50 for that correspondence. So a Bayes factor of 50 means that the correlation is 50 times more probable on the hypothesis of design than on the hypothesis of coincidence. Now, let's consider a second example. There's an interesting connection, not wholly independent of the one that I just discussed, but nonetheless worthy of our attention. And that has to do with Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem 5 days before the Passover, on which he died. In John chapter 12, it mentions that Jesus approached Bethany 6 days before Passover, and verse 12 says the next day he rides into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey. So that's 5 days before Passover, Jesus makes just triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Now, it turns out that if you look at the Old Testament, in particular in the book of Exodus in chapter 12, we read that the Jews were to select their Passover lamb and bring it into their homes 5 days before Passover. And so you have this interesting correlation where the year that Jesus enters Jerusalem 5 days before Passover is the year in which he meets his death by crucifixion on the day of Passover. Now, can we confirm that detail, that Jesus really was crucified or rather, that he really did enter Jerusalem 5 days before Passover? Well, I believe that we can. Let me just run you through an historical argument that shows this. I've shared my screen to Logos Bible software. We look at verse 1 of chapter 12. So 6 days before Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany where Lazarus was, and Jesus raised from the dead, and they give a dinner for him there, and he stays there as his accommodation. The following day, verse 12, the large crowd that had come to the feast heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. So they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him. Now, if we look over at Mark's gospel, which I've pulled up here on the right, Mark actually telescopes the account. So he doesn't mention that Jesus actually approached Bethany the night before, and it was in the morning to go to get the colt. But he telescopes it. And when you get down to verse 9, it says, those who went before, and those who were shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David, Hosanna in the highest. So notice that Mark does not mention that Jesus' triumphal entry was 5 days before Passover. That's a detail only John gives us. But verse 11 says, he entered Jerusalem, went into the temple, and when he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. That's where his accommodation is for the night. So that would make it, if John is correct, that would make it the evening of 5 days before Passover, because it said it was already late. So assuming John to be correct, that's the evening of 5 days before Passover. Verse 12, on the following day when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. That would be the morning of 4 days before Passover, assuming John's chronology to be correct. Verse 19, when evening came, they went out of the city. That would be the evening of 4 days before Passover, assuming John's chronology. Verse 20, as they passed by in the morning, that would then make it the morning of 3 days before Passover, if John is correct. And then you've come to the Olivet Discourse in chapter 13, where Jesus has a conversation with his disciples on the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Olives, of course, is midway between Jerusalem, where he's been all day, and Bethany, where his accommodation is for the night. So we can assume, I think fairly, that this is the evening of 3 days before Passover. He's on his way home for the evening. Chapter 14, verse 1, it was now 2 days before the Passover. And so it synchronizes exactly as you would expect, given the chronology of the Gospel of John. This is therefore supporting that Jesus really did enter Jerusalem 5 days before Passover, and thus supporting this coincidence. That the year of Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem 5 days before Passover happens to be the year that Jesus is killed on the day of Passover, thus fulfilling the Passover imagery. Now, it must be borne in mind that this coincidence is not wholly independent of the previous one, since Jesus coming to Jerusalem on Nisan 10th would not matter at all if it weren't for the fact that he then died subsequently at least around that time. So if we take the entry into Jerusalem on Nisan 10 to be significant, we must be assuming that he died right around that time, which means that one entails the other. The question that we can ask, though, is how much additional evidence it provides that Jesus also entered Jerusalem on Nisan 10th, which is the day that the Jews were to select their Passover lamb according to Exodus 12 and bring it to their homes. Another factor for us to consider is that Passover is a particularly likely time for a Jew to enter Jerusalem anyway, and also a time when you could count on ministering to a large crowd of people who had made their pilgrimage to Judea for the feast. So I'm just going to assign a conservative base factor of 2 to that fact. So far we've got a base factor of 50 and a base factor of 2, which means it takes our cumulative base factor thus far to 100 because they multiply together. A third example is Jesus as the first fruits. So 1 Corinthians 15:20 describes Christ as the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. Now, what's being alluded to there? Well, for the answer, we can turn to Leviticus 23, in which we read of the Feast of First Fruits, which was to be celebrated on the day following the first Sabbath, following Passover, or the Sunday. And it was to celebrate the guarantor, as it were, the first fruits of the harvest. It was the guarantor of the later harvest to be delivered. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 20 linked Jesus to the Feast of First Fruits. Christ was the first fruits of the resurrection, having been raised prior to the general resurrection at the end of time. Although previous people had been raised from the dead, such as Lazarus, those individuals were not raised to glory and immortality. They would die again eventually. Jesus, though, was the first person in all of history to be raised to glory and immortality with a body transformed such that it was no longer subject to decay or death, and thus he is the sheaf that is waved before the Lord, the first fruits of the harvest. Now, what's this? As I said, according to Leviticus 23:11, that was to be celebrated the day after the Sabbath following Passover, and that's a Sunday. And so it can hardly be a coincidence that the claim of the resurrection, but the earliest claim of the resurrection by the apostles was that Christ was raised on the Sunday following the Passover. And so when we consider the day that Jesus was claimed to be raised as a first fruits from among the dead, the Sunday following Passover, we have yet another striking coincidence. It's largely taken for granted among scholars that the disciples had experiences following Jesus' death that they interpreted to be the raised Christ. Scholars are largely in agreement that the disciples didn't deliberately lie about having seen Jesus raised from the dead. And so we have a strong evidence that the claim was that Jesus rose from the dead on the Sunday following his crucifixion. Not only is it reported in all 4 Gospels, but there's also the widespread switch from observing the Sabbath to observing the Lord's Day on Sunday in the first century as well. So that's a third fact, which I think is an interesting and striking coincidence. A further one is the crucifixion of Jesus, which correlates with Psalm 22. I assigned that previous one, by the way, a base factor of 5, which takes our cumulative base factor to 500. A fourth one is the crucifixion of Jesus, correlating with Psalm 22, which I assigned a conservative base factor of 1,000 to, taking our cumulative base factor to 500,000. Fifthly is the name Jesus itself, which means Yahweh is salvation, which is an interesting, very striking coincidence, and also correlates with some Old Testament passages like in Zechariah 6, for example, and Zechariah 3, where a foreshadow of the Messiah is called Joshua or Jesus. So I assign a conservative base factor of that of 2, taking our cumulative base factor to 1 million. And finally, another final example is the fact that that Christianity becomes the dominant world religion that it becomes. And according to various passages in the Old Testament, such as Isaiah 49 verse 6, part of the Messiah's job description was to bring representatives of all nations to a recognition of the God of Israel. So Isaiah 49 verse 6 says, he says of the Messiah, "It is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to bring back the preserved of Israel. I'll make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth." So on the hypothesis Jesus really is the Messiah, the probability of Christianity becoming the international global religion that it became is actually quite high because it's predicted in the Old Testament. What's the probability, though, on the hypothesis he's not the Messiah? Well, until 313 AD, where you have the Edict of Milan, Christianity was a persecuted minority, and they were under intense persecution by the Roman officials and authorities. And it seemed the probability that Christianity would become such a dominant global religion seemed vanishingly small. But on the probability that Christ is the Messiah is very, very high. So I assign a conservative base factor of that of 1,000, taking our cumulative base factor to 1 billion. Now, just assuming when we're doing Bayesian analysis, we have to also assign a prior probability. That is the probability of your hypothesis given just the background information. Now, just for the sake of argument, we can assign a prior probability as low as 1 in 10 million. Which leads to a posterior probability of 0.99 of the hypothesis being true, which is a very high posterior odds, especially given such a ridiculously low base factor of 10 million, 1 in 10 million. And so that I think is a powerful way to argue from the argument for Messianic prophecy, with atheists building this cumulative argument from multiple correspondences with the Old Testament in the Gospels, which points towards design. And since it's not design of the human author, because these events really happen and we have historical evidence they happen, therefore it points to the hypothesis of divine design. So I'll conclude with that. Thank you.